I'm Sarah Jackson, host of Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, a listening experience choreographed to help you elevate your internal communications to the pro level.
When we talk about communications planning, most people jump too quickly to the tactics and to a calendar of events. And it's much more impactful if we take a step back, talk with our business partners and say, what are we trying to accomplish this year? What are the goals that we really need to drive as a business, and how can communications support and enhance that? So you need to understand the business, and you also need to understand what you're trying to accomplish from a communication standpoint. Let's have this be something that is our calling and something that we wake up in the morning excited to do.
That's Lisa Ramsey, Director of Corporate Communications at Healthcare Service Corporation, who you might know as Blue Cross Blue Shield. Today we're talking about strategic planning. You know, Gallagher recently released their 2021 State of the Sector survey. They surveyed over 800 internal communicators globally, and 40% reported that they have an overarching internal communication strategy. In 2020, it was even lower, only 33%. And it's no wonder some internal communicators tell me that they struggle to get above their work and make that transition to become more strategic. Listen, you know me, I am always wanting to dive in and really unearth the steps of how to get there. And today, Lisa walks us through step by step on how to build your overarching strategy and plan. This and much more on today's show.
My name is Lisa Ramsey. I am Director of Employee and Corporate Communications at Healthcare Service Corporation, but most people know us more colloquially as Blue Cross Blue Shield of Illinois, Montana, Texas, Oklahoma, and New Mexico.
Well, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with me this afternoon. I know we're going to be talking about building an internal comm strategic plan, but before we get into all that, give us your backstory. How did you get into this great world of internal communications?
I think I am a bit of an anomaly in our field because this is where I have spent my entire career. So I started out as a communications consultant at Hewitt Associates, and that part of the business after the Aon acquisition is now called Alight, I believe, where I focused on benefits and compensation communication. So totally internal at that point, but working in a consultative manner. And then I shifted to freelance work for several years while my kids were small. And I built a business doing a variety of communications. I did some marketing, some HR, a little bit of external, but predominantly, again, internal, because that's where my clients knew me from. And then when I returned to the corporate world, I shifted into a healthcare area in a role with a medical device company and spanned both internal and external, but I would say it was definitely 80% internal. And from there, moved to a pharmaceutical company, and again, a mix, but still heavily internal, but also, got in some reputation management, some crisis comms, some social media. And then when I made the switch to HCSC, now I'm fully in a dedicated internal communications role.
Well, I love hearing that backstory because this makes you the perfect person for us to talk to with the topic at hand. We have grown our audience sort of in a slow, organic way, but the benefit of that is we're super close to them. So every year we ask, okay, for this season, what is it that you want to hear and know and learn about? And they still want to compare and see how do I build an internal communications strategic plan. They're always wanting to, compare their plans with others. So we want to talk about that today and get us started. I mean, it seems like you've potentially done this now with the different, um, positions and roles that you've played. Before people start to go down this road and really think about their plan for 2021, what challenges or pitfalls have you seen or have you seen, even in your own experience, do people encounter when they start to develop and approach building their own internal comm strategic plan?
It's a great question. So when I think about it, we do a great job with strategic planning in lots of other areas of industry, right? So financial planning, that's really locked down how you do that, how you do kind of long range planning. And then the communication side, I think I do love what you said about people are always asking questions and wanting to compare. I think that is one of the beautiful things about working in internal communications is that we're all willing to share our experiences and tell people what we thought worked well, what didn't. And I think one of the most important things is to really understand your business first. So I tell my team all the time, you are business people first with a deep expertise in communications. So, to be able to communicate effectively and to partner effectively with the business, you have to understand the business you're in. So, having a key understanding of business acumen, the demands on the business, the pressures, the objectives of the business. If your company is one that presents a formal business strategy, take it and run with it. Make sure that you know it forward and backward and that you can ask intelligent questions about it. I think another challenge that we need to address is that when we talk about communications planning, most people jump too quickly to the tactics and to a calendar of events. And it's much more impactful if we take a step back, talk with our business partners, and say, what are we trying to accomplish this year? What are the goals that we really need to drive as a business? And how can communications support and enhance that? And then from there, you start to talk about all the other aspects of communication. Who are your audiences? What are their different needs? What are the key messages that you really want to resonate throughout the year or whatever the period of time is if you're developing a plan for a specific campaign versus an annual plan? What are the other considerations you need to take into account? What other communication is hitting employees about other areas of the business or things that are happening outside of your business? And then you get to the discussion around what are the channels? What do we have available at our disposal? What do we know really works well for a particular audience, and how can we make that as strong as possible? So really, and the last thing that I say we don't often do well, but I'm starting to see an improvement is in how we leverage our leaders' voices. So people want to hear from their leadership, they want to hear from their people managers, particularly, and we need to make sure that we are helping them be the most effective communicators they can be. And so some of that, and we can get into lots of details about this, but some of that is really knowing who they are and building a good, trusting relationship so that you don't hold back from giving them helpful feedback and that you know them well enough, you know their strengths so that you can play to those strengths. So I think, those are the things I would say, not leaping too quickly to tactics, making sure you really understand the business and what communication can do for it. And then using your leaders' voices or whoever your spokespeople are as effectively as possible.
That is so good. I love that piece about showcasing and playing to the leader's strengths. So I want to touch back on something when you said, hey, start with the business goals. So give me a little polish of how do I do that? Would I reach out via email to each of these leaders and state our intention? Like, how do I actually, is that a series of meetings? Um, how long should this be taking me? Is this something I can do in a weekend, or is this going to be, to do an effective plan? If you do this process, it's going to take 30 days. Give me some sense in the getting in the weeds on this a bit.
I think it really depends on your company's business planning process. But we always say we want to be at the table. And so part of that is making sure that you have that relationship with the team that you are partnering with from a communication standpoint. So let's say you are the communicator for the financial division of your company, or maybe you're the HR communicator. It's working with those leaders and setting the time to say, I'm beginning to build out your strategy, or our strategy is probably a better way to phrase it. And I want to really understand what are the challenges we're facing and what are we trying to accomplish as a team. And so for most companies, that's happening on an annual process. So that there's at some level, there is a here's what we're trying to accomplish as a company, and here's how that translates by division, by team, or whatever it is. And then ultimately, we as employees build our performance goals on those. So it's taking that very high level piece of it, asking the right kinds of questions to make sure you really understand it, and then building it out. So I would say it's a multi-month process typically, because you want to start with both looking back at what has been effective in the past and understanding again your audience, your the channels you have available to you. How are you building out that multi-channel approach, and then looking at the business objectives and saying, okay, how do I take this from what may seem like all acronyms and business speak and put this into language that employees can really understand? Because the end goal for employee engagement is that you want employees to truly understand and believe what they need to do, and how they do it helps drive the success of the business, which ultimately is the success of that person. So you want somebody at every level of the business to say, my company makes widgets that improve people's lives in these ways, and here's my part in it. So I would say, I'll just use this year as an example. So we started with the business planning process in late November, early December, and about mid-January really finalized those plans and then can begin to roll those out to the company. So it's really a multi-month process, but it's not as if you're working on that 24/7. There's give and take, and there's conversations with your leadership. And of course, it's not just the leadership, your business partners in the business, but it's also making sure that what you're doing as a communicator is laddering up and supporting to the broader corporate communications goals as well. And that would encompass both internal and external social media. No matter what your part of it is, we're all interconnected. So you need to understand the business, and you also need to understand what you're trying to accomplish from a communication standpoint.
Well, and this, I think, supports it, as we have more and more of these conversations with so many folks, that there really is an art and a science to this industry. And it's validates, I think, the complexity here, because what I hear you saying is the process of having those series of meetings to find out the goals and the way you choreograph that conversation, that feels like, well, I'm trying to get to the science piece of, all right, I'm filling in this plan. The way you go about that, there's an art to it that then manifests itself in this trusting relationship, which then results in that relationship being built on trust, and one where they see the internal communicator as their strategic partner. Speak to me a little bit about that. Do I have that right? There's a power in the process.
You do. There's definitely power in the process. And the questions that you answer and the way that or answer that you ask, that and the way you demonstrate your knowledge of the business goes a long way to create that trusting relationship. So I say do your homework, know what the business is going through, know what the business is trying to accomplish, but continue to press and ask questions. No one will ever fault you for asking questions, but we run into pitfalls when we make assumptions and we don't ask questions, and we build out a strategy that is either, overwhelmingly complex, or that misses steps somewhere along the way, that we either leap to communicating directly to employees without bringing supervisors and managers along for the ride, or that we really haven't helped the leadership understand the power we have with internal communication to engage and activate employees.
Gosh, it's so good. Forgive me for this question, but in the spirit of being vulnerable and asking what might be a stupid question, do you use like an Excel spreadsheet to put this in? Like, how do you actually, is there a tool that you use to, what do you physically put all these plans in? How do you build this out?
I prefer to do this in PowerPoint. So we do supplement that though with an Excel spreadsheet that is more the tactical calendar so that we can track progress on what we've decided to do. But I usually start with a PowerPoint, and that is just a personal preference. It works well for me. And I like to think visually. I cannot create graphics to save my life, but I can think graphically. And the smart art tab in PowerPoint has been a lifesaver for me. So really, it's finding a template, and there are a million out there, right? A multitude of agencies and other places can provide those if you just even do a search on the internet for them. So I think it's really finding one that works well for you, or you may be in a structured enough environment in your company that you're given one and told, we're going to work toward this. But the bottom line is that you need to find a way where you're asking basically the journalist principles of who, what, when, where, how, and why, so that you can think about what are the key objectives, what are the key messages, how are you going to reach out to them, who needs to know, what are the best ways to reach those people, and you know, recognizing that a multi-channel approach is always going to be more effective. And I think sometimes that's hard for people to understand, especially if you're kind of laying out, well, we're going to talk about this in a town hall meeting, and there will be articles, and there will be this, and we'll post it on our internal social channel, and we'll do these things. And people will say, well, people will get tired of hearing it. There are studies around the number of times you need to hear something for it to absorb. So it's always good to have a multi-channel approach from that standpoint, but we all have personal preference too. Some of us prefer to read and we like to have links to click through and get lots more detail. Some of us just want our managers to give us the highlights. Some of us want to watch a video. So the more you can build in a multi-channel approach, and then this is really key too when you're building out a strategy, is how are you measuring the effectiveness of this? And that's always been the bane, I think, of internal communicators' existence, is figuring out how to look at what we're doing and be able to say, look, this was effective. We engaged this many people. This is the feedback we got, and it's doing that. So really, those are the things, the who, what, when, where, why, and how. Defining your channels, defining your messages, defining your, deciding who your messengers are, and then how are you going to measure your success.
The Internal Comms Pro Collective is proudly supported by Circle Broadcast. Jumping back and forth between the handfuls of platforms you manage to fix a single misplaced comma is so frustrating. What if you could create, edit, and distribute all of your internal content from one centralized platform? With Circle Broadcast, you can simplify and innovate your IC tech stack with their cross-channel comms approach. With one click, just publish and send your content to your employee email, SharePoint, Teams, and mobile app. Now your employees can consume it on the channel of their choice. Head on over to circle.com/ICP to learn more about their unique internal comm solution. That's CERKL.com/ICP. Now don't worry, you won't have to Google the internet for your strategic planning template. You know me, I've got one for you, and it's gonna be Lisa approved. You can download it for free at internalcommspro.com/show notes. You'll hear us talking about this template at the end of this episode and how the template even came to be. Also in this next part, Lisa gives us her tips on how to communicate the ROI of your work, and she shares how she surveys her employees and measures the effectiveness of her initiatives like meetings and town halls. Now let's jump back in. That is so good. And I think I love hearing what people are doing, because I think you look like you think, Oh, Blue Cross and Blue Shield must have this high tech tool. I love hearing work with what you're comfortable with and to ask the question before you go down the road, is there a pre-existing framework that I need to be operating in to show our part of the plan, or is it, hey, no, go knock yourself out, you build your own, and whatever, if you are cool with Excel, if you are cool with Word, PowerPoint, Google Docs, to figure that out also on the front end from a tactical standpoint. I love that. To a little bit more on this ROI. So if you build in your metrics and you're seeing what you're learning, you're seeing successes, you're seeing on where you can improve strategically here when you're talking about you've now opened kind of the floodgate to talk to these business leaders because you had the initial conversation. Any tips on how do I go back and communicate where we did succeed? Is that in an email? Do you have follow-up meetings? Talk a little bit about how do I communicate the ROI of our work?
Absolutely. So we build it in, as I say, into the plan. So as we set out the plan, we're tying, this is where what we're working to accomplish. And then we have a number of ways that we share that feedback. So we do a quarterly update generally for our business partners to say, here is what we've sent out. You can always start with some of the analytics, right? Most of us have really great analytics at our disposal. We just need to get comfortable with using them. So, what were the open rates on emails? What were the page views? What were the number of clicks? How much time did people spend on the page? If you offer the ability for people to like or comment, what was the feedback on that? What was the sentiment around it? But then I think the other piece that we really need to make sure we're doing is, did the communication have some sort of call to action, and how well was it heeded? Did we make a clear connection to business outcomes? And if we can show that in our work, that's terrific. It's a little, some of it's more quantitative, qualitative versus quantitative, because, if we're doing one of my favorite feedback forms, if we do spot surveys. So either during a meeting, if you can use an app to get instant feedback with questions as you're going through, or after an event to send a very brief, because brief is key. People don't like to spend a lot of time on surveys, questions to ask about the effectiveness of the meeting. And if you've done it right, you have said for this meeting in this example, you know, these are the key messages we want employees to take away. Then you ask the question, what were your key takeaways from the meeting? And if those two line up, you're golden, right? You've done exactly what you set out to do. People heard what you were saying. And then you can ask some sentiment questions about, how well do you understand your part in the company's success? If you're working to build your culture, you can ask questions around your culture. And if you keep those questions consistent over time, so let's say you do 3 or 4 town halls a year and you ask the same questions roughly, after each one, but you ask some more specific questions about the specific content, you can start to see patterns and you can start to see what's effective. And truly, my favorite part of any survey is the open answer section, because you can get so much rich information from that supports the numerical data that says, 80% of the employees felt that this meeting was a good use of their time, things like that. So when you start to think about it in those ways, it really gets exciting, and it's speaking the language of the business to your business partners, and they truly appreciate that.
I love Lisa, you're making me feel like I could do this and I feel motivated and we've go heading into 2021. I think a lot of our listeners are like, "Oh my gosh, another marathon." But this makes me feel excited cuz it feels like it's not as complex now and that I've always get this question, has anyone ever tied all of this together from start to finish? And this feels so nicely buttoned up, especially with Okay, yes, I might have metrics, but then how do I go back and communicate them? It's so good. What any other best ideas you've seen when it comes to strategic planning?
One thing that I strongly advocate for is that this shouldn't be a solo activity. So it may be, if you are lucky enough to have a team working with you, bring them in. So, especially if you've got people who are a little bit more junior on your team, this is part of making our practice stronger for the next generation. Not just tomorrow. Of course, we want it better for tomorrow too, but just keep it going. So, really bring in your whole team and help them jump in. And maybe they're not presenting to the senior executives when you present the plan, but having them be part of the process, having the full team be part of the process will open the floodgates for creativity. And I will tell you honestly, you can tell from my background, I'm not new to this. So for me to have people from other generations on my team who can say, "Ooh, we could do this," and they look at it through a different lens, it just ramps up the creativity and the opportunity to be innovative in our communication. And isn't that what we all want to do? Don't we all want to have, find the ways to be creative and fun and throw in a little strategy too, but let's not have this be a slog. Let's have this be something that is our calling and something that we wake up in the morning excited to do.
Well, you're gonna be mad at me for having you on the show because I think you're gonna get a flood of calls like, "I wanna work on Lisa's team. I wanna be part of" that's a model leader that I would wanna be a part of that's inclusive, and I think for those leading teams to not, underestimate the power of involving the team in the strategic planning process, particularly if it's their first, job, out of college, it would be a meaningful moment. And what a great teaching moment. I love that so much. Okay, so last question here. I know we're wrapping up. It's in the spirit of coaching others and particularly maybe some younger in their career. If you could go back to your younger self, what advice would you give about working in this world of internal communications, particularly during this period of time in history with the pandemic, the turbulent year we've had, and now coming into 2021?
There are so many things I would love to go back and tell my 22-year-old self as I was starting out on my career. This year was crazy. There's just no other word to describe it. I know we all overused unprecedented to death, but it really was. And it was such a test of our ability to stay calm and to be really flexible. So, the advice I would give my younger self is a couple of things. I would tell myself to not take myself so seriously, that things will change and it's okay for things to change. I think making sure that we are really resilient in the way we approach this work. And then one of the things that I definitely saw this year among myself and my colleagues was we had to rethink the way we approached some of the review processes. So that would be advice I would give to everybody, is that if you haven't gone back and looked at where the pain points were, how hard it was to get information out or how easy it was, is I would say, be open to, and this would be advice to my younger self too, would be open to self-criticism and be open to feedback from others on the way you're actually doing your job. Because what we found is that in a normal review process where you can say, I can give you 3 days to get back to me, and I'm going to really think ahead and plan ahead and give you all this stuff. In a crisis situation, you have to operate differently. And I think for many people, crisis communications is relegated to a specific team. But this year we all became crisis communicators. And so we had to be much more nimble, and we had to be much more comfortable with ambiguity, which for me would be, reminding my younger self, don't lock in and be inflexible about things. We're not going to have all of the answers. And I think it's okay for us and for leaders to say to employees, here's what we know now, and here's what we are thinking about. And many times that's enough. People just want to know that somebody is thinking about these things and that they are planning to take action. So, in our situation, it was the most crazy, fluid situation. We have employees across 5 states. And so with the pandemic, we were balancing feedback from the federal level, from the state, from the local level. We had, stay-at-home orders coming in at different points. And for people in a professional role like me, you tell me I need to go home and work at home, fine. I unplug my laptop, I take it home. But for many of our employees, they don't have laptops. They're working with very specialized computer equipment. And so we had the big effort of figuring out how to deploy not only the people home, but the equipment, and to help people make sure that they had the right kind of internet access and space that they needed to be able to continue to do their jobs safely and at home. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but I think it really comes down to just that flexibility and staying calm. The world's not on fire. We're okay. We'll figure it out.
It is so true, but I love hearing you say it. Makes me feel better about it. I think also within that flexibility you talked about, we're supposed to be innovating and doing that, and I think that's a cornerstone and a theme I see now with internal communicators, or that it's okay to not have the polish on this thing, that we got to get it out, we got to go, we got to learn, we got to be flexible. It feels like lots of us have had to be okay with being not comfortable, and so I love hearing you talk about the discomfort and the, again, having to roll with it and being so open and fluid. I think is definitely a skill set we're all learning and growing. So that's awesome. Well, I can't thank you enough for laying this out. It makes me feel like I can do it. And again, we'll have, if I lay a document out, I don't know if you have a template, but if we do one and I can show it to you, will you grade us and be like, yep, you've got all the steps in there? And then we'll share it with our audience if you would be open to reviewing if I heard you right and if I learned.
I would be happy to. Absolutely.
Okay, great. Well, we'll do that and then we'll share it with our audience. I think that'll be a great download for them. And if people did want to connect with you, are you open to them connecting with you on LinkedIn? How can they get a hold of you?
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter. You can connect with me on LinkedIn. Totally open to that.
Oh, good. Well, we'll link all that in the show notes too. I know folks like to sometimes have one-off conversations and follow up with our guest. So, well, I can't thank you enough for spending the afternoon with me, for giving us some insight and look into internal comm strategic planning. So super helpful for our listeners.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Well, there you have it, folks. All the elements of how to build your internal communication strategic plan. And don't forget to download our strategic planning template at internalcommspro.com/show notes. Stay with us next week as our journey to uplevel your internal communications to the pro level continues.
Internal Comms Pro, the podcast, is produced by the Internal Comms Pro Collective and proudly supported by the Circle Broadcast Suite, an entire suite built for internal communicators. Learn more at circle.com. And don't forget to visit www.internalcommspro.com/show notes for our free resource guides. Thank you for listening.